What's going on, guys? It's Greg here, aka New York Prepper. In this video, I'm going to talk to you guys about how to survive a nuclear war. And this is part 6 in my How to Survive a Nuclear War series. And if you haven't seen the prior parts, I recommend you go and watch those videos first before you watch this video, because this video expands upon all of the concepts that I taught in the prior videos, parts 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. So I highly recommend you go and watch those videos first, those parts, before you watch this part. And I'll leave links to those videos and to my nuclear war survival series at the top of your screen. And I'll also leave links in the comments section to my nuclear war survival playlist and to my How to Survive a Nuclear War series playlist, which has all of these parts in it. So in this part, I'm going to be talking to you guys about radiation protection concepts and some of the basic fundamentals of radiation protection. And you really have to master these fundamentals before you can even think about building a fallout shelter or finding a fallout shelter. So if you're a little bit confused after watching this video one time, I recommend that you re-watch it as many times as you need to truly understand all of the information that I'm about to share with you. This is just absolutely critical information here, and you have to understand these concepts before you can even think about fallout shelters and gas masks and any kind of radiation protection. And in this video, we're just going to be strictly focusing on the fundamentals of radiation protection. We're not going to dive deep into fallout shelters and how to build a fallout shelter and how to find a suitable fallout shelter. That's going to be reserved for future parts in the series. Most likely it'll be in part 7 or 8, which will be the next 2 videos. But I don't want to talk about those concepts yet, because you have to master these fundamental concepts first before you can think about fallout shelters and other radiation protection measures. So that's what we're going to do in this video. We're going to focus on these fundamentals, master them, and then we're going to move on to finding fallout shelters and building fallout shelters and figuring out what constitutes a suitable fallout shelter. And then also in future parts, I'm going to talk to you guys about how to protect yourself from some of the other effects of a nuclear explosion, which are the blast wave or overpressure, and the thermal radiation, which is the high temperature, which can cause third-degree burns or even worse. So that's going to be reserved for future videos, so just be patient with me. This is a very big topic, and it's hard for me to squeeze all of this information into a 15-minute video. And this topic is so important that it's worth spending enough time to really discuss all of the different aspects of nuclear war survival. It's just not something I can compress into 2 or 3 videos or even 5 or 6 videos. This is going to be a very long series. So I apologize for that, but there's really no way around it, okay? And for those of you guys who are taking the time to diligently watch these videos and take notes and mastering all the fundamentals that I try to teach you, you guys are taking a huge step towards preparing yourself for nuclear war and any kind of nuclear emergency. So without further delay, let's get started. All right, guys, so before I get into the meat and potatoes of the video, I want to just quickly recap some of the doses that I talked about in part 5. And this is the reason why I tell you guys to watch the prior parts before you watch this part, because if you didn't watch the part before this one, you're not going to know what any of this means. But if you did watch that part, let's just quickly recap and refresh our memory of some of the critical radiation dosages or doses that we need to be familiar with and we need to commit to memory. So the maximum yearly dose allowed for radiation workers by the EPA, and radiation workers are people who work in nuclear power plants, like engineers, technicians, power plant operators, security guards, anybody that works in the nuclear industry and is exposed to radiation on a daily basis. Their maximum yearly dose, as required by the EPA, is 50 millisieverts or 5 rads or 5 rems. Okay, so just remember that. That's considered the maximum yearly dose allowed for radiation workers in the United States. Okay, the cancer threshold is considered to be 100 millisieverts or 10 rads or 10 rems. So the cancer threshold is double the maximum yearly dose for radiation workers. Okay, the cancer threshold just means that once you get to 100 millisieverts of exposure or 100 millisieverts of, not exposure, I'm sorry, of absorbed dose, your body absorbs this much radiation, your chances of cancer begin. Okay, now at this level of absorbed dose, the cancer percentage, the chances of having cancer is very low. Okay, but this is the threshold where the chances of cancer start. Okay, and then as you go up from here, the chances increase more and more. Okay, but this is the threshold, is 100 millisieverts or 10 rads or 10 rems. The maximum dose allowed for emergency responders engaged in life-saving work is considered to be 250 millisieverts or 25 rads or 25 rems. Okay, so 250 is really the number that you want to keep in the back of your mind when we're talking about how much dose we should absorb, okay, after a nuclear war or nuclear attack or some kind of nuclear explosion. We really don't want to absorb more than 250 millisieverts, okay? That is the maximum dose that we really want to have, because once you go above that, that's when you can run into radiation sickness, okay? So this is the maximum dose for first responders engaged in life-saving work. They should not get more than 250 millisieverts or 25 rads or 25 rems. Radiation sickness begins at 400 millisieverts, so not much higher than the max dose for first responders, okay, engaged in life-saving work. Only 150 millisieverts more is when radiation sickness begins, okay? Now, if we're talking about a nuclear war or nuclear attacks of some kind, you really don't want to get any kind of radiation sickness, because you have to remember that even if you get radiation sickness during normal rule of law conditions, it's still going to be a slow recovery with a lot of complications. And I'm going to talk about more in depth the biological effects that radiation has on the human body, okay? But you really don't want to get any radiation sickness, especially if we're talking about nuclear war, because you're not going to have the same healthcare infrastructure after a nuclear attack as you do before a nuclear attack. There's not going to be hospitals around every corner. Everything is going to be shut down for a while. You may not be able to get treatment at all. And if that's the case, you may die a slow and miserable death, and you're not going to be able to protect your family from all the dangers out there in the world in a post-nuclear war world. So you really don't want to get any radiation sickness. So for us, we want to remember 250 millisieverts. That's the maximum that you should absorb, okay? 250 millisieverts. Severe radiation sickness begins at 2 sieverts, which is 2,000 millisieverts, or 200 rem, or 200 rads. Okay, so that's where severe radiation sickness begins. This is a really bad area. You really don't want to get severe radiation sickness. Looks like I forgot an N over here. I had radiation. I forgot to put the N, so it's radiation. Okay, you don't want to get severe radiation sickness. It's really not a fun thing. If you guys are ever bored, you can go onto Google and just search radiation poisoning, and you'll look at the pictures, and it's just completely horrific what happens to people when they get severe radiation sickness. If you really want to freak yourself out, watch the HBO series. It was a mini series called Chernobyl, and that show will really give you nightmares. The horrors of radiation poisoning that the Chernobyl liquidators had to suffer after being exposed to a massive amount of radiation at the Chernobyl reactor when they were trying to clean it up and protect the population around the reactor. These brave firemen risked everything to try to clean up the radioactive material, and in the process they saved a lot of lives, but they received a very high dose, in many instances a fatal dose of radiation, and they really suffered. But I highly recommend that mini-series Chernobyl, and even if you just go onto Google and look up radiation poisoning, and look at the images, look at the pictures, it'll really freak you out. So severe radiation sickness starts at 2 sieverts, or 200 rems, or 200 rads, and then the severe radiation sickness that's still possible to survive with medical care is 4 sieverts, or 400 rems, or 400 rads. So double the amount of the severe radiation sickness. Where severe radiation sickness begins, it's 2 sieverts. And the maximum that you can get and still survive with medical care is 4 sieverts, or 4,000 millisieverts. And the fatal dose is considered to be 8 sieverts, or 800 rads, or 800 rems, okay? So just remember that. If you want to take a screenshot, you can pause the video and take a screenshot and save it on your phone. But you should easily be able to remember this. This is only 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 numbers that you have to remember, okay? So commit this to memory, because we're going to be working off of these numbers as we go further into the series and we take a deeper dive into radiation protection. We're going to have to keep these numbers in the back of our head, okay? And also, in an actual nuclear emergency, you're going to want to remember what your thresholds are. So when you're monitoring your radiation dose with your radiation dosimeter, which I talked about in part 5, you're going to want to know what's the maximum amount that I can absorb before I start to get sick. You're going to want to know that, okay? If you don't know these numbers, you're going to be completely lost, okay? So remember these numbers here. So I'm going to continue with the video now, and we're going to talk about the basic fundamentals of radiation protection. So stay tuned. All right, guys, so these are the big 3 radiation protection concepts that you need to master and you need to really understand thoroughly. They're not hard to understand, but once you understand these concepts, you're going to realize why I always say that nuclear war is survivable. All right, so we have distance, we have time, and we have shielding. Okay, these are the only 3 ways that you can protect yourself from radiation. You can protect yourself by putting distance between you and the radiation source. You can protect yourself by waiting a certain amount of time for the radiation to decay to a lower level where it's not harmful. and you can also protect yourself by putting up some kind of shielding. Okay, so an example of shielding is a fallout shelter or any kind of dense material that can block the gamma radiation from being absorbed by your body. All right. Another example of shielding is a lead vest that you wear when you go to the dentist. When the dentist gives you an x-ray, they put that lead vest on your chest. That's shielding. Okay. So I'm going to now explain in detail what all of these really mean to you and why it's important to understand these things. So we're going to start with distance. Okay, distance, you have the inverse square law. You have to understand all these different things here. You have the inverse square law for distance. You have the 7-10 rule for time, and you have halving thicknesses for shielding. These are the ways that you can reduce the radiation or protect yourself. You can protect yourself via inverse square law, 7-10 rule, and halving thicknesses. Okay, so I'm going to talk in detail about these. So the inverse square law is a scientific law, and a lot of you guys out there that are into chemistry and physics, and if you're any kind of a science nerd, you're going to know what inverse square law is. But if you don't know what it is, I'll give you the textbook definition. An inverse square law is any scientific law stating that a specified physical quantity is inversely proportional to the square of the distance from the source of that physical quantity. Okay, so what does that mean? All right, in layman's terms, what it means is if you double the distance from the radiation source, you're going to reduce the radiation by 4 times, okay? If you triple the distance, you're going to reduce the radiation by 9 times. And if you quadruple the distance, you're going to reduce the radiation by 16 times, okay? So, because what you're doing is you're squaring the distance, okay? So you're doubling your distance value. So I'm going to give you an example of the inverse square law in the real world, okay? Let's say you have a radiation dosimeter or a Geiger counter, and there's fallout outside of your house, right up against the exterior wall of your house. You know that there's really no other radiation source but that fallout outside of your house up against your exterior wall. Let's say you're 5 feet away from that wall and you take a measurement, and the measurement says 60 millisieverts, okay, per hour. That's your measurement. That's how much radiation you're absorbing, 60 millisieverts per hour, by being 5 feet away from the wall. And on the other side of the wall, you have the very high radiation from the fallout. If you double the distance and you move out to 10 feet, okay, you go 10 feet away from the wall, because when you measured 60 millisieverts per hour, you were 5 feet from the wall. But let's say you go another 5 feet, you're doubling the distance. By doubling the distance, you're reducing the radiation 4 times. So now the radiation is only going to be 15 millisieverts per hour, okay, just by moving another 5 feet away. Okay, you see how that works? Now, let's say you moved another 5 feet, okay, so you triple the distance. Now you're 15 feet away, okay, you're 15 feet away, you tripled the distance. Now it's going to be 9 times less. So if you do the math, 60 divided by 9. So if we triple the distance, we get 6.67 millisieverts per hour. You see how only moving a few feet away from the source? Look at the difference in radiation now. You were at 60 millisieverts per hour, 5 feet from the radiation, and you move to 15 feet away, only another 10 feet, and you reduce the radiation down to only 6.67 millisieverts per hour, which is a really low number. That's very good. If you move another 5 feet away, that's quadrupling the distance. you're now going to drop the value to 3.75 millisieverts per hour. So you're reducing the radiation 16 times, okay? So just remember that. What you're going to do is you're just going to square the distance to get the reduction, okay? So if you double the distance, that's 2 squared equals 4. If you triple the distance, that's 3 squared equals 9 times less. And if you quadruple the distance, that's 4 squared, which is 16 times less, okay? So this is really important to understand because obviously you want to put distance between you and the radiation, but this actually gives us some hard numbers that we can work with. And this is a reason why nuclear war is very survivable, because even if you don't have a basement or some kind of suitable underground shelter, just by moving away from the exterior walls of a structure, you can greatly reduce the radiation, because most of the radiation is going to be outside of a building because of the fallout. The fallout is going to settle on the roof and on the ground. Okay, anything that can collect the fallout is going to settle on that object. Okay, so typically the ground and the roof of structures is where most of the fallout is going to be. So just by moving to the center of a structure, you're reducing the radiation quite significantly. Now, obviously, if you're in a stick frame house has very little shielding, which we'll get into in a minute. So a stick frame house, you're still going to reduce the radiation, but it's going to be so high upstairs on the ground level or the top floor of a stick frame house, because there's basically no shielding from the plywood and the drywall that makes up the exterior walls. That's like no shielding at all. So even if you put distance between you and the outside, it's still going to be so high that it's going to be too dangerous. But if, let's say, you're in a brick building or a reinforced concrete structure like an office building, even like a building that's made of cinder blocks or some kind of stone, some kind of dense material like that, just by moving towards the center of the building, away from the walls, and also in the centermost floor of the building, will reduce the radiation significantly, okay? Because you already have the cinder blocks or the bricks or the reinforced concrete or whatever dense material. Let's say you have a 6-floor office building that's made of reinforced concrete, okay? The walls are reinforced concrete. You want to basically be in the 3rd floor, so you're kind of in the middle of the building. You're not close to ground level and you're not close to the roof, because you don't want to be close to the roof because that's where a lot of the fallout is going to settle, and you don't want to be near the ground because that's where the fallout is going to settle too. So you want to put yourself in the middle floor, and then you want to put yourself in the actual middle of that floor. And by doing that, you're using distance to help you, okay? You're putting distance between you and the radiation source, and then also the shielding is helping you there as well, because you have the reinforced walls. And I'll talk about all this in future videos where I talk about, finding fallout shelters and things like that. But this is a very important concept. Now we have time, okay? Time is probably the most important concept when it comes to nuclear war survival. Time and shielding are probably more important than distance. Time and shielding are going to be your best friends in a nuclear war, okay? These are going to be your best friends. Distance is important as well, but time and shielding are probably more important. So for time, we have the 7-10 rule, okay? This is very easy to understand. For every factor of 7 in time that you go forward into the future, the radiation is reduced by a factor of 10, okay? So what does that mean exactly? So what that means is, let's say right now as we speak, I take a measurement with my dosimeter, and we get 100 millisieverts, or let's say 1,000 millisieverts per hour. Okay, that's our dosage, or our dose, our absorbed dose right now. 1,000 millisieverts per hour this second. Okay, 7 hours from now, we're going to have 10 times less. Okay, the radiation is going to decay. Okay, it's going to decay by a factor of 10 because we went forward by a factor of 7 in time. We went forward 7 hours, so it's going to decay by a factor of 10. Okay, so now after 7 hours, we're only going to have 100 millisieverts per hour. Okay, now another 7 hours, which would be 49 hours from time 0. Okay, another 7 hours would reduce it down to 10 millisieverts. Okay, so just within 2 days, because 7 times 7 is 49 hours. Okay, so we went 2 factors of 7 in time. We went 7 times 7, that's 2 days. And we went 2 factors of 10 down in radiation. So in 2 days, we reduced the radiation from 1,000 millisieverts per hour to 10 millisieverts per hour. Do you see how big of a difference that is, guys? That is absolutely a massive difference. And this is why I always say that the first 48 hours after a nuclear attack are the most critical. You need to be in a suitable shelter for the first 48 hours, okay? Especially the first 48 hours after the fallout lands, okay? And it can take up to several hours for the fallout to land, depending on how close you are to the detonation point of the nuclear warhead, or what the wind conditions are like, the yield of the warhead, the burst altitude. There's a lot of factors, and I talk about that in part 4, 5, and 5. So if you want to learn more about that, watch part 3, 4, and 5. But you can see here at time 0, okay, 1,000 millisieverts per hour, okay. If you remember, what was the point at which radiation sickness begins? Do you remember that? It's 400 millisieverts per hour is where radiation sickness begins. Or I'm sorry, 400 millisieverts. If you take a dose of 400 millisieverts, you're going to start to get radiation sickness. So here we have 1,000 millisieverts per hour. Okay, so you're going to get radiation sickness just by being exposed to this radiation within minutes. Okay, within minutes, you're going to get a very high dose. You're going to get radiation sickness. Okay, so if you have 1,000 millisieverts per hour, so that means in 30 minutes, if you're exposed to the radiation without shielding and you get the full dose here, okay, in 30 minutes, you're going to get 500 microsieverts. Okay, because it's 1,000 millisieverts per hour. So in 30 minutes of time, you're going to get 500 millisieverts of dose. You're going to get radiation sickness within 30 minutes of exposure here. But if we wait 48 hours, look at the big difference here, guys. Radiation sickness, 30 minutes at time 0, and at time 49 hours or 2 days, we're going to have 10 millisieverts per hour. So it's going to take you 10 times 40. It's going to take you 40 hours to get radiation sickness, okay, after 2 days. You see that difference here, guys? This is a massive difference, okay? 30 minutes radiation sickness, and then within 2 days, you're going to get radiation sickness after 40 hours. Okay, that is literally almost 2 days of being outside and exposed to the radiation with nothing, no protection, no shielding. So this is a big reason why nuclear war is survivable, all right? Because you have this 7-10 rule, and a lot of ignorant people that know zero about nuclear war and radiation and nuclear war survival. They have this urban legend and this myth that's been propagated by video games and movies that, nuclear war means the end of the world, and there's going to be nuclear winter, and the whole world is going to be irradiated for years, and we're not going to be able to grow food anymore, and there's going to be starvation. And to a certain extent, yes, there will be starvation. There will be crops that die. There will be livestock that die and get irradiated. But it's not going to be as bad as people say, where the whole world is going to be a radioactive wasteland for 20 years or something, or even more than a few months, okay? The 7-10 rule, okay, as you see, within 2 days, look at the difference, okay? At time 0, let's say this is right after the bomb went off, you would get radiation sickness within 30 minutes. But if you wait 2 days and you're sheltered for 2 days and you don't go outside, you stay in your basement, you stay in your fallout shelter, let's say this is the outside radiation that you measure, okay? Before you go into your fallout shelter, you're outside of your house. Let's say you have a good solid basement like I do here. And let's say you're outside and all of a sudden the fallout starts landing. The bomb went off, let's say 2 hours ago, and you're outside and you have your radiation dosimeter, and your dosimeter says 1,000 millisieverts per hour. Okay, that's how you know that the fallout is really coming down hard. Okay, so then you go into your shelter, you go into your basement, and you wait it out. You wait 2 days or 49 hours. After 2 days, the radiation will be significantly less, and it'll take you 40 hours to get radiation poisoning, okay? So that is just a huge difference here, okay? That's just a huge difference, massive, okay? You go from 30 minutes to 40 hours it takes to get radiation sickness, massive difference, okay? And then if we wait another factor of 7, okay, which would be 2 weeks, because remember, you go 0 to 7, that's 1 factor of 10. Then you go from 7 to another factor of 7, that's 49 hours or 2 days. And then if you take 49 hours and you multiply it by 7, you get 14 days. And then you're down to 1 millisievert per hour after 2 weeks, okay? And 1 millisievert per hour, do the math, okay? You needed a dose of 400 millisieverts to get radiation poisoning. So if you divide, you're going to have to be outside 400 hours at this point to get radiation poisoning. And by the time you get to 400 hours, it's going to be decayed again, and it's going to be very low, and it's going to be basically gone. Okay, 400 hours. That's a lot of hours, okay? So as you see, sheltering is critical. You have to have a suitable shelter so you can wait out the fallout, okay? You have to give it enough time for the fallout to break down and decay, okay? That's called radioactive decay. And a lot of you guys are going to say right now, I'm sure there's probably some people that are thinking, oh, well, if that's the case, how come nuclear power plants like Chernobyl, how come they're still radioactive? If what you're saying is true, NY Prepper, why is Chernobyl still radioactive and it's been, 30 or 40 years now? Well, the reason why is the 7-10 rule applies to fallout. It doesn't apply to radioactive fuel rods, okay? Actual radioactive materials like plutonium and uranium, it doesn't apply. Okay, this just applies to fallout, okay? Fallout. It does not apply to nuclear fuel rods, plutonium, enriched uranium, nuclear reactors, okay? It does not apply. It applies to fallout only, okay? Just remember that. So that's why for fallout, we can survive the fallout. We can survive a nuclear war. We can survive nuclear attacks, okay? But Nuclear power plant meltdowns are totally different, and nuclear power plant meltdowns are much worse than nuclear weapons, okay? Because when the power plant melts down, that radiation stays in the ground for 20,000 years until the radioactive material decays, and that's a completely different topic. Then you're talking about half-lives, and that's something that you might have learned in grade school. You might remember half-lives, okay? And a lot of those, like plutonium and uranium, they have a half-life of like 10,000 years. So what that means is it takes 10,000 years for the radiation to decrease by 50%. So Chernobyl is going to be deadly for, probably 100,000 years, okay? But when we're talking about fallout is different, because remember in the prior parts, if you didn't watch the prior parts, I'll just quickly summarize, but fallout are like little sand particles. It's all the debris that gets sucked into the mushroom cloud. It's kind of like radioactive ash, like from a volcano you have ash, or when you burn a fire and when you're camping you have ash that comes out. It's basically the same thing, and it gets irradiated from the explosion. But because those particles are so small, they're like sand, they don't hold the radiation very long, okay? They decay rather quickly through the 7-10 rule, okay? They're not plutonium, they're not uranium, they're just very small particles the size of sand that get irradiated from the explosion, and then they rain down everywhere. But those little sand particles, it's not a source of radiation. It's not pure radiation. It's not a pure piece of uranium or a pure piece of plutonium. I hope you guys understand what I'm trying to say. So that's why fallout is survivable, okay? And if you didn't watch my prior videos, I recommend you watch part 3, 4, and 5. That's where I talk about how nuclear bombs actually work, and I talk about the different parts of a nuclear bomb and the explosion and the different effects of the explosion. I talk about the radiation and all that. So I'm not going to get into that here because for the sake of time, I want to just focus on this. So 7-10 rule, okay, this is a big reason why we need to shelter in place. The first 48 hours, you don't want to leave your shelter at all, okay? You want to stay in your shelter for the first 48 hours without leaving for any reason at all, okay? After 48 hours, you can leave your shelter, and I mean, it depends a lot on what the actual radiation is, because if you're at 5,000 millisieverts instead of 1,000, you still have a lot of radiation after 48 hours. You're going to get 50 millisieverts per hour rather than 10 millisieverts per hour. So you're still going to be able to go out of your shelter, but you're going to have to reduce your time outside of your shelter. So remember this rule, and you can use this to calculate the radiation if you ever do have to survive a nuclear attack. Okay, but the first 2 days are absolutely essential. You have to be in a suitable shelter the first 48 hours so you can survive this early fallout. They call this the early fallout. This is the most dangerous time period after a nuclear weapon explodes, is the first 48 hours. That's when you have that really high radiation. After 48 hours or 2 days, it breaks down to a more manageable level where you can go outside of your shelter for very limited periods of time to do certain things, okay? For example, let's say you have to empty waste, okay? When you're in your shelter, unless your shelter has a built-in bathroom and some kind of redundant water supply where you're going to be able to flush the waste down a sewage pipe, you're going to have to empty your human feces somewhere. You can't have your feces build up inside of your shelter. So you're going to have to dump your feces somewhere outside so, you don't get sick in your shelter. Or you may have to leave your shelter temporarily to restock some supplies, grab some food and water that you have stored in your basement or somewhere else. So first 48 hours are essential. And after the first 48 hours, you can go outside for limited periods of time. But really, you want to basically stay in your shelter for the first 2 weeks after a nuclear explosion. You want to stay in your shelter for like 90% of the time, okay? Then you have shielding. Shielding is another very important concept, okay? With shielding, you have what are known as halving thicknesses. And all the halving thickness is just how much material does it take to reduce the radiation by 50%, okay? So different materials have different halving thicknesses. For example, dirt, water, air, wood, concrete, lead, steel, aluminum. Different materials have different halving thicknesses depending on how dense they are. Typically, the denser the material, the better the halving thickness is going to be. So, for example, steel and lead, you don't need a lot of steel to have a good halving thickness because steel and lead are very dense. But concrete or dirt is a lot less dense, so your halving thickness is going to be greater, okay? That's why when you go to a dentist, all they have to do is put that lead vest on you, and that protects you from the radiation, okay? But if they didn't have a lead vest, you would literally have to put bricks on your chest to get the same amount of radiation reduction because bricks are much less dense than lead, okay? So that's kind of just a simple way of visualizing it in your head. The denser the material is, the smaller the halving thickness. And in order to really protect yourself from radiation, you need to have several halving thicknesses, okay? So these are the 3 critical concepts that you need to understand, you need to master. If you need to rewatch this video, go ahead and do that now, or pause the video and take a screenshot, write some notes down, whatever you want to do. But remember, distance, time, and shielding. Distance, you have the inverse square law. So when you double the distance, you square that. So 2 squared is a reduction of 4 times. You're going to reduce the radiation 4 times if you double the distance. You're going to reduce the radiation 9 times if you triple the distance. And you're going to reduce the radiation by 16 times if you quadruple the distance, okay? Inverse square law, okay? Just remember that. For time, you got the 7-10 rule. For every factor of 7 in time, you reduce the radiation by a factor of 10. And shielding, you have halving thicknesses. And shielding is really very, very critical. And the reason why shielding is so important is because without shielding, time and distance are not going to be enough, okay? Even if you quadruple your distance, if you're in an area where there's a very high level of radiation and you don't have any shielding at all, even if you quadruple the distance, it may not be enough, okay? You're still going to get a lot of radiation. And time is not going to help you enough either, because even if you wait 7 hours or 49 hours or 2 weeks, the radiation is still going to be so high because you're not going to be shielded at all that you're still going to take a massive amount of radiation. You're still going to absorb a massive amount of radiation. So shielding is critical, okay? So these are your fundamental concepts. You need to understand these things: shielding, time, distance, okay, inverse square law, 7-10 rule, and halving thicknesses. All right, so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to talk a little bit more about halving thicknesses and expand a little bit upon that, because that's very important to understand for fallout shelters and suitable shelters for protection against radiation. So let's continue on with shielding. All right, guys, so I want to just talk to you a little bit more about shielding. We have some critical concepts here to understand about shielding. You have your common halving thicknesses for different materials here. Okay, I listed them out for you, and you could find these on the internet. And what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to post all this information on my website, newyorkprepper.com. I'm going to create a separate area where I'm going to post all this kind of reference information about halving thicknesses, about protection factors, which I'm going to get into in a minute, and some other cheat sheets and data sheets. So this way you guys don't have to go searching for it. I'm going to post it all on my website free of charge. So that should be up sometime in the near future. And right now it is January 20th, 2022 at the time of filming this video. So hopefully sometime in the next few weeks I'll have all this raw information for you on my website, so you don't have to go looking for it. I'm going to post the halving thicknesses and a bunch of other reference materials for you. So we have lead. The halving thickness for lead is 0.4 inches or 1 centimeter. So 0.4 inches of lead is going to reduce radiation by 50%. Okay, that's why when you get an x-ray, all you have to do is wear that thin vest made of lead. Okay, that's a very thin vest. It's probably 1 halving thickness in thickness. Okay, and steel, you have 1 inch. 1 inch of steel reduces radiation by 50% or 2.5 centimeters. Concrete, you need 2.4 inches of concrete or 6.1 centimeters. So that's why I was saying that to reduce the radiation from the x-ray, if you didn't have your lead vest, you would probably have to put bricks on your chest, okay? Just regular red bricks or concrete cinder blocks. You'd have to put them on your chest to get the same effect as the lead vest, because the lead vest, all you need is 0.4 inches of lead to have the same effect as 2.4 inches of concrete. So that's a huge difference, okay? So moving on from concrete, you have packed soil. 3.6 inches of packed soil or 9.1 centimeters of packed soil will reduce radiation by 50%. And then you have water. Believe it or not, water is actually good radiation shielding. And water is used in nuclear power plants for protecting from radiation. And water is very good at shielding neutron radiation. So the halving thickness for neutron radiation is different because neutron and gamma radiation are two separate things. So this is mostly for gamma radiation, okay, which is mostly what we're going to be dealing with when it comes to residual radiation after a nuclear attack, which is basically fallout. Okay, fallout is going to be 99% gamma radiation. But water is used in nuclear power plants to shield from the neutron radiation around the nuclear fuel rods. Okay, so they submerge the fuel rods in water because water is really good at blocking neutron radiation, but it can also block gamma radiation pretty good as well. So for water, you need 7.2 inches of water to reduce the radiation by 50% or 18 centimeters. And wood, believe it or not, wood is also a good material. 11 inches of wood can reduce the radiation by 50% or 29 centimeters. So you can actually use things like lumber or firewood or landscaping timbers. You can use those as radiation shielding to build yourself a field expedient fallout shelter. But again, it takes 11 inches of wood just to get 1 halving thickness, okay? Versus concrete, you only need 2.4 inches, or packed soil, you only need 3.6. So you would need a lot of wood. I mean, if you think about like a railroad tie, you know, most railroad ties are about 10 inches by 10 inches. To get 4 halving thicknesses, you would need 4 railroad ties stacked together, and you would have to make a wall, or basically a shelter from 4 railroad ties thick. You'd have to have a wall 4 railroad ties thick. Okay, you would need 44 inches of solid wood to get 4 halving thicknesses. Okay, versus packed soil, to get 4 halving thicknesses with packed soil, all you would need is 4 times 3.6. That's going to be about 14 inches. Okay, so 14 inches of packed soil is the same as almost 4 feet of wood. So that's a huge difference, guys. And that's why I recommend that everybody have sandbags in their home, because you can fill those sandbags with dirt from your yard, and you can stack those sandbags up and build a fallout shelter in your house or in your basement. And those sandbags are going to have 2 or 3 halving thicknesses, possibly even 4 halving thicknesses, depending on the width of the sandbag and how many sandbags you stack together. Okay, so these are your halving thicknesses. Okay, now moving on from halving thicknesses, we have protection factors. Okay, now protection factor, it seems very confusing, but it's really not. It's very straightforward. So 1 halving thickness reduces the radiation by 50%. So let's just use steel, because steel has a nice even number. It'll be easy for us to work through. So let's say you have 1 inch of steel. Okay, 1 inch of steel. Let's say you have a bunker, and you built a bunker out of steel. Okay, you have 1 inch thick steel plates all around you. That's going to reduce the radiation by 50%. Or give you a protection factor of 2, okay? And protection factor is basically just, if you remember from grade school, you have your factor is your bottom number, okay? When you have an equation like 1/2, the bottom number is your protection factor. So you're reducing the radiation by 1/2. So you write out 1/2, okay? 1 halving thickness, reducing by 1/2, or 1/2. Your protection factor is going to be 2, okay? Now, if you add another halving thickness, so now we're up to 2 inches of steel, okay? You're going to reduce the radiation another halving thickness. So you're going to reduce the radiation quite a bit, and you're only going to get 1/4 of the radiation, because you were at 50% radiation with the 1 halving thickness. Now you're at 2 halving thicknesses, so you're only getting 25% of the radiation now. Okay, so therefore you have a protection factor of 4, because you have 25% or 1/4 or 1/4. Okay, so your protection factor is 4. Now, if we add another halving thickness, 3 halving thicknesses, then we only are receiving 12.5% of the radiation, okay? And that's going to have a protection factor of 8, because we're getting 1/8 of the radiation now. Okay, so 1 halving thickness, we're getting 1/2 of the radiation. 2 halving thicknesses, we're getting 1/4 of the radiation. 3 halving thicknesses, we're getting 1/8 of the radiation, or a protection factor of 8. 4 halving thicknesses, we're getting 1/16 of the radiation, or a protection factor of 16. Okay? 5 halving thicknesses, we're getting a 1/32 of the radiation, or 3.125% of the radiation, and that gives us a protection factor of 32. Okay, so it seems confusing, but it's really not. So this would be 1 inch of steel, okay, 1 inch of steel. This would be 2 inches of steel. This would be 3 inches of steel, 4 inches of steel, 5 inches of steel. Because remember, 1 halving thickness of steel is 1 inch, okay? So 1 inch of steel, you get 50% reduction for a protection factor of 2. 2 inches of steel is 2 halving thicknesses, 1/4 of the radiation, or protection factor of 4. 3 inches of steel, 3 halving thicknesses, you get 12.5% of the radiation, or 1/8 of the radiation, protection factor of 8, and so on and so forth. Okay, I hope this makes sense. If you guys are still confused, just write me an email, nyprepper85@gmail.com. If there's anything in any of my videos that confuses you, just send me an email, nyprepper85@gmail.com, and I'll try my best to explain it to you. If you have any questions, you can also leave them in the comments, but emails are better because I get so many comments on my videos. It's hard for me to go through every single comment. I get thousands of comments. So send me an email if you have any questions about any of this or on any of my videos. All right, guys, so now we're going to go through the halving thickness calculations again, but this time we're going to use packed soil, okay? Because in my opinion, packed soil is what is most available for the average person. Unless you decide to build a fallout shelter in your basement, which I highly recommend these days, you can actually go and get fallout shelter plans from the old civil defense from the 1950s. They actually used to put out video instructions and detailed plans of how to build fallout shelters in your basement from using concrete blocks. And I'm going to actually post that to my website as well. And you can actually use a fallout shelter as a safe room, so it has multiple uses. You can store your preps in there. You can use it as a safe room if, let's say, your house gets overrun by marauders and you have to retreat somewhere. You can go into your safe room or your fallout shelter and take refuge there. So I want to use the packed soil in our example here. And I want to show you how sandbags can really be very effective in stopping radiation and blocking it and shielding the radiation, okay? And this is why I recommend sandbags, because you can get yourself 18-inch wide sandbags for 50 cents a bag, okay? So for $50, you can get 100 empty 18-inch wide sandbags, and you can fill those empty sandbags with dirt from your backyard. All you need is a few shovels and a few helping hands, and you can fill a lot of those sandbags relatively quickly, and you pack them in so they're packed. What you actually should do is wet them with water, get them a little bit wet, and then pack them, so this way you're also taking advantage of the water in the soil rather than just dry soil itself, and the water also helps to pack the soil together, okay? So let's say you have 18-inch sandbags and you build yourself an igloo in your basement from 18-inch sandbags, okay? And let's say you spray the sandbags with water. Let's say you have a hose or you have buckets of water and you wet them. So one 18-inch sandbag filled with packed soil, 18-inch wide, will give you 5 halving thicknesses, or a protection factor of 32, or it would reduce the radiation down to only 3.125%. Okay, so if the radiation outside is 1,000 millisieverts per hour, and you reduce it by, you're basically reducing it by 97%. Okay, with one 18-inch thick sandbag, 18-inch wide sandbag filled with packed soil is going to reduce the radiation by 97% from what is outside of that packed soil sandbag, okay? So let's just go through everything here. So one halving thickness of packed soil, 3.6 inches, reduces the radiation 50% for a protection factor of 2. 7.2 inches of packed soil gives us 2 halving thicknesses, which reduces the radiation down to 1/4 or 25%, or a protection factor of 4. 10.8 inches of packed soil gives us 3 halving thicknesses, or 1/8 of the radiation, so 12.5%, or a protection factor of 8. 14.4 inches of packed soil is going to give us 4 halving thicknesses, or 1/16 of the radiation, which is 6.25% of the radiation, or a protection factor of 16. And 18 inches of packed soil, like I said, gives us 5 halving thicknesses, 3.125% of the radiation, or 1/32nd of the radiation, or a protection factor of 32. Okay, so this is why sandbags filled with soil, and especially if you wet that soil, they can be very, very effective at creating a field expedient fallout shelter. Okay, you can use them as a material for your field expedient fallout shelter, your hasty fallout shelter. All right, guys, so most government agencies recommend a protection factor of 10 as a minimum, okay? And again, protection factor of 10 would mean you get 1/10 of the radiation outside of the shielding. So you'll only get 10% of the radiation from what's outside of the shielding. Protection factor of 20, you would get 1/20th of the radiation, or 5% of the radiation. And protection factor of 30 would give you 1/30th of the radiation, or 3.3% of the radiation. So, and so on and so forth. Okay, but that's what protection factors are. That's what halving thicknesses are. Okay, just make sure you understand these things. You don't have to memorize these numbers. It would be very smart for you to print out the halving thicknesses that I mentioned here on a piece of paper and laminate them and put them in a safe location so you have a reference. So when crap hits the fan, when there's no internet, you're not going to be able to Google search halving thicknesses. You have your laminated card that's going to tell you how much lead, how much steel, concrete, soil, water, wood, etc. And they have halving thicknesses for pretty much any material. It's not just these. These are just the most common, okay? But they also have halving thicknesses for sand, for aluminum, for stainless steel, carbon steel, tin, different alloys, all kinds of stuff, okay? So, and I'm going to post all that on my website, so be patient. And I'm going to post a lot of information, very detailed information on all different kinds of halving thicknesses for a variety of different materials, okay? So just be patient with me, and I'm going to post all of that onto my website so you have that information there. But really make sure you understand protection factors, what it means, halving thicknesses, and the percentage in reduction. Okay, 1 halving thickness, 50% reduction. 2 halving thicknesses, 25%, because you're reducing it again. 3 halving thicknesses, 12.5%. 4 halving thicknesses, 6.25%. Okay, so if you can get 3 or 4 halving thicknesses, you're in a pretty good spot. Okay, you're going to be right around the government recommended protection factor of 10, because 3 halving thicknesses, you're going to get a protection factor of 8, so only 12.5% of radiation is going to make it through. And 4 halving thicknesses, you're going to be at a protection factor of 16. So even if you're at 3.5 halving thicknesses, which will be around 12 inches of dirt, of packed dirt, you're going to be at around a protection factor of 12, and that'll get you below the government recommended minimum, and you'll be in a really good position, okay? So just remember all this stuff, and remember distance, time, and shielding. Those are the 3 critical concepts for protecting yourself from radiation. You need to know the inverse square law, the 7-10 rule, halving thicknesses, and protection factors, okay? Time and shielding are going to be the most important thing. Distance is also important, especially if we're talking about above ground shelters. If you can't get underground, then you're going to want to put some distance between you and the radiation source. And the best way to do that is to move to the middle part of a building, like I mentioned. So if you're in a 6th-floor office building and it's made of reinforced concrete, but it doesn't have any basement, what you're going to want to do is get to the 3rd floor, so you're halfway between the roof and the ground. And then you're going to want to move to the middle of the 3rd floor, so you're as far away from any kind of walls or windows as possible, okay? And that's where the inverse square law and the distance really help you is when we're talking about above ground shelters, because I know a lot of people have been telling me that they don't have a basement and they live in Florida or they live in the South and there's no basements anywhere. What do I do? So that's what you do. You find a heavy duty structure that's made of concrete blocks, bricks, reinforced concrete, or even stone. A lot of old buildings in the southern United States are made of stone, okay, dating back from the Civil War. A lot of buildings are made of stone, and stone is a very good shielding material. It has a really good halving thickness. So if you find yourself a stone structure, or you find an multiple story office building that's made of reinforced concrete, and usually those office buildings, if they're more than like 4 or 5 floors, the concrete is really thick because it has to support the building. The walls have to be solid so they don't collapse when it's windy. So usually you have at least like a foot of concrete all around the building, and that's going to give you several halving thicknesses, just that reinforced concrete wall, because you have 2.4 inches of concrete gives you 1 halving thickness, okay? So if you have 1 foot of concrete, you're going to have 5 halving thicknesses, okay? And you're going to reduce the radiation to a protection factor of 32, which is extremely good. So even just a 1 foot thick concrete wall will give you 5 protection factors and reduce radiation to 3.125% of what's outside, okay? So that's the solution to those people out there that say that they don't have a basement or there's no underground structures where they live. Okay, I'm sure there's above ground structures that have multiple floors. I'm sure there's 4, 5, 6, 7 story apartment complexes in any city in the South. And those types of buildings usually have thick walls, and they would give you suitable shielding. And then all you'd have to do, like I said, is move to the center of the floors and pick the centermost floor. So if it's a 6-story building, you want to be on the 3rd floor, and you want to be in the middle of the 3rd floor, okay? So what we're going to do now is I'm just going to do a quick calculation so we can apply everything that we learned so far about distance, time, and shielding, and protection factors and halving thicknesses. We're going to do a simple calculation of how much radiation protection we get based on certain amount of time, certain amount of distance, and certain amount of shielding, okay? And this will really test our knowledge and test your knowledge to see how well you understand this. So let's do this exercise together. All right, guys, so now we're going to do an example together. I'm going to test your knowledge, and we're going to do this example together. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you a problem, and after I give you the problem, I'm going to ask you to pause the video and try to solve the problem. And once you think you've solved the problem, click play, and you're going to be able to check your answer to see if you got the problem right, okay? So I'm going to write the problem out now. All right, guys, so here's our scenario. We had a Russian 1 megaton nuclear warhead detonate 100 miles away from us. And because we're 100 miles away from the 1 megaton warhead, that puts us in the 100 rads per hour fallout contour. Okay, so the maximum amount of fallout is going to give us 100 rads per hour. Once the fallout has fully fell from the sky, it's going to give us 100 rads per hour outside at our location from the 1 megaton Russian warhead. So if you remember the conversion from rads to millisieverts, remember the differences between rads and millisieverts and rems, okay? Millisieverts and rems are equivalent dose. That's what most radiation dosimeters work with. And rads are the absorbed dose. If you remember from the earlier parts, that's how much the objects in the area, they absorb 100 rads per hour of radiation. And we as human beings absorb millisieverts and rems, okay? And 1 rad is equal to 10 millisieverts. So 100 rads per hour means that there's 1,000 millisieverts per hour outside, okay? Right after the explosion of the Russian warhead, the 1 megaton warhead, we're 100 miles away, so that puts us in this fallout contour. And so remember, radiation sickness begins at 400 millisieverts, and the maximum dose that's recommended by the government for first responders engaging in life-saving activity is 250 millisieverts, okay? So we have to do something here, because if we're outside, remember the 7-10 rule, and remember shielding, and remember distance. We're going to use that in this equation, in this problem here. So we have to do something about this. We don't want to be outside in these conditions for a long time, because remember, radiation sickness starts at 400 millisieverts of dose. So once you receive 400 millisieverts, you're going to start to get radiation sickness. And outside, it's 1,000 millisieverts per hour, okay? So what does that mean? So that means after 30 minutes outside, we're going to get radiation sickness, okay? Because it's 1,000 millisieverts per hour, and it only takes 400 millisieverts to get radiation sickness. So around 30 minutes, we're already going to get radiation sickness. So we have to do something here. So what I want you to do is I want you to calculate how much radiation reduction we're going to get if we go into a 1-foot thick concrete building. Let's say we find a 6-story office building that has a 1-foot thick concrete exterior, okay? The walls of the building are made of 1 foot of solid concrete, okay? And we go inside of that building. How much radiation is there going to be once we're inside of the building? Okay, remember, it's 1 feet of concrete all around the building. And don't even think about windows and stuff. Just think about the wall of the building. The exterior walls are 1 foot thick of concrete, okay? And it's 1,000 millisieverts per hour outside. What's the radiation going to be inside once we get inside of the building? Remember, concrete has a halving thickness of 2.4 inches, okay? So tell me, how much radiation are we going to be receiving if we're inside of the building? So pause the video, work on it, and then hit play when you're ready to have me explain to you the answer. All right, guys, so that 1 foot of concrete of the exterior walls of the building is going to do a very good job at blocking the radiation. So we started with 1,000 millisieverts per hour outside, and we have 1 foot of concrete. So you divide 12 inches by 2.4 inches, which is going to give us 5 halving thicknesses. So 1 foot of concrete is 5 halving thicknesses. 5 times 2.4 is 12, okay, 12 inches. So 5 halving thicknesses. We start with 1,000 outside. We have 5 halving thicknesses. So the first halving thickness drops it to 500 millisieverts per hour. The second halving thickness drops it to 250 millisieverts per hour. The third halving thickness drops it to 125 millisieverts per hour. The fourth halving thickness drops it to 62.5 millisieverts per hour. And the fifth halving thickness drops it to 31.25 millisieverts per hour. Okay, so you see the huge difference that the 1 foot concrete wall, the reinforced concrete wall of that apartment building or office building, whatever it is, skyscraper, it reduces the radiation significantly, okay? Only 31.25 millisieverts per hour, okay? So remember, 400 millisieverts of a dose, 400 millisieverts to get radiation sickness. And initially, when we were outside, we could get sick within 30 minutes. Once we moved inside behind the 1 foot concrete wall, it's now going to take us 400 divided by 31.25. So let's see what that is. I'm going to do that really quick and we'll get an exact number. Okay. How many hours we would have to be inside before we get radiation sickness. So 12 hours, okay? You would have to be unprotected inside of the building for 12 hours to get radiation poisoning. So it went from 30 minutes to 12 hours. You see the huge difference there the 1 foot of concrete makes? Okay, so we're going to continue on with this example and we're going to do some other calculations now. All right, guys, so we realize now that we have about 12 hours before we're going to get radiation sickness. So the radiation is still fairly high inside of that reinforced concrete building. So what we have to do is we have to add some extra shielding. Okay, let's say, for instance, we have access to sandbags and we have 18-inch sandbags laying around and we fill the sandbags with soil and we make ourselves a little igloo out of those 18-inch sandbags. Okay, so the walls of the igloo are 18 inches wide, the widest part of the sandbag, the 18-inch wide part. Okay, remember, packed soil, 3.6 inches per halving thickness. So now I want you to calculate how much radiation will we absorb inside of our sandbag igloo inside of the 1 foot thick concrete wall building. Okay. All right, guys. So we made our igloo out of the 18-inch thick sandbags. We filled those 18-inch sandbags with dirt, and that reduced the radiation by another 5 halving thicknesses. So that's going to give us a protection factor of 32. So that's going to drop the radiation down from 31 millisieverts per hour down to 0.97 millisieverts per hour, okay? And if we want to figure out how many hours it's going to take to get radiation sickness, we're going to divide 400, because 400 millisieverts is when you start to get radiation sickness. We're going to divide that by 0.97. It's going to take us 412 hours to get radiation sickness inside of our sandbag igloo made out of 18-inch wide sandbags filled with packed dirt, okay? So that's a huge difference, 412 hours inside of our sandbag igloo versus 12 hours just inside of the building versus 30 minutes outside of the building. Okay, so we went from 30 minutes to getting radiation sickness outside. We go inside of the 1 foot concrete wall building. Okay, the building is made of 1 foot thick concrete walls. We go from 30 minutes to radiation poisoning to 12 hours. We drop the radiation from 1,000 millisieverts per hour to 31 millisieverts per hour. 12 hours, 30 minutes to 12 hours inside, and then from 12 hours, we go to 412 hours when we're inside of our sandbag igloo, okay? And the radiation goes down to 0.97 millisieverts per hour. And if you want to see how many days 412 hours is, we'll just divide 412 by 24, 17 days, okay? It would take 17 days inside of that sandbag shelter to get radiation sickness. And remember, the 710 rule, this radiation is going to break down. So 31 millisieverts per hour is what we measure right now. Okay, let's say we measure that right now inside of that 1 foot concrete building, but after 7 hours, it's gonna decay by a factor of 10. Okay, so after 7 hours, we won't even get to 12 hours here because it's going to decay rapidly. The first 7 hours, it's going to decay by a factor of 10. Okay, so it's going to go down to 3.1 millisieverts per hour after 7 hours. Remember that. Okay, so that's a critical calculation for shielding. And remember the 710 rule. So if it's 1,000 millisieverts per hour outside, 30 minutes to get radiation sickness, roughly. Okay, let's just round up 500 to make it easier. 500 millisieverts to get radiation sickness rather than 400. So that'll take us 30 minutes outside to get radiation sickness. If we wait 7 hours before we go outside, it's going to decay down to 100 millisieverts. Because remember, after 7 hours, it's going to decay by a factor of 10. So we're going to go from 1,000 to 100 millisieverts per hour. And once we're at 100 millisieverts per hour, it's going to take 5 hours to get radiation poisoning. Okay, that's just after 7 hours. Now, if we wait another factor of 7, which would go up to 49 hours or 2 days, okay, because 7 times 7 is 49 or 2 days. We drop down from 100 millisieverts to 10 millisieverts per hour after 2 days. So after 2 days, we go from 1,000 millisieverts per hour to 10 millisieverts per hour. Huge difference, okay? And then it's going to take us 50 hours to get radiation poisoning outside. Okay, so you see how the first two days are essential to be sheltered in place because you have 1,000 millisieverts per hour outside. You get radiation sickness within 30 minutes. After 7 hours, you're down to 100 millisieverts per hour, and then it'll only take you 5 hours to get radiation sickness. That's still not a lot of time. And then another factor of 7 down to 2 days. You go from 7 hours to 2 days. Then it's going to take you 50 hours to get radiation sickness. So you see how the first 2 days are essential, that you need to have a suitable shelter the first 2 days because this is when the radiation is really high. Okay, you're not going to be able to. You're not going to make it. You're not going to survive. If you're out in the open, you're going to die for sure. Okay, but after 2 days, the radiation drops enough to the point where you can go out on a limited basis every day. You could go out of your shelter for, let's say, an hour each day to dump your waste out or to do other chores that you need to do, whatever the situation is. Resupply your water, resupply your food, stretch your legs out, whatever the situation is. So these are some very critical concepts, guys. Wanted to really dive deep into it. I hope you learned something here. I hope you absorb all this. If you need to rewatch the video, rewatch it again to make sure you understand everything. If you have any questions, like I said, email me, nyprepper85@gmail.com, and I'll answer all of your questions as best as I can. Comments are going to be harder for me to answer because I get so many comments. Like I said, I get thousands of comments a week. And I'm just not going to be able to go through them. I'm going to miss your question. Okay, so please send me an email. And in the subject, because I also get a lot of emails, but I get much less emails than I get comments, just put it in the subject that this is a question about nuclear war survival. Say, question about nuclear war survival. Put that in the subject. Okay, just do that. Just put question about nuclear war survival. And this way it'll pop right up and I'll be able to see it and I'll know that it's not spam or something else. So, but this is really important. And in the next video, we're going to talk a little bit more about sheltering and finding suitable shelter. We're going to take a deep dive into what suitable shelters are. Now that we know all these numbers here, we can figure out what is a suitable shelter. We kind of already started to do that. As you see, you have to be behind a 1-foot concrete building, and you need to have a 18-inch sandbag, okay? But again, that's assuming that the concrete building doesn't have any dirt around it. This is why basements are superior to above ground structures, because above ground you only have that 1 foot of concrete, okay, which doesn't reduce the radiation enough. It reduces it down to the point where you're still going to get radiation sickness within 12 hours. But if you had a 1 foot concrete wall and it was underground, like in a basement, your protection factor is going to go way up, okay? Because now you're surrounded by several feet of dirt around you, okay? So it's gonna add many protection factors to the point where you won't even need the sandbag. You're not going to need the sandbag anymore, okay? If you're inside of a multi-story structure that has a 1 foot reinforced concrete walls all around it. If, let's say you have a 6-story office building with 1 foot thick reinforced concrete walls, and you're in the basement, and you have pretty thick flooring above your head, because remember, the radiation is going to penetrate through the floors above you. It's going to penetrate through the actual floors. So let's say you have pretty thick floors above you. It's going to reduce the radiation to the point where you don't need those sandbags anymore, okay? So that's why basements are many times better than above ground structures for radiation protection, because you can take advantage of the dirt all around you by being underground. All that dirt, you know, remember, 3.6 inches of packed soil is 1 halving thickness. So if you're underground, you have many feet of dirt all around you, okay? So part 7, we'll talk more about shelters and get really deep into those shelters. But that's pretty much it for now, guys. Thanks for watching. Take care. God bless. And don't forget the 3 Ps. Prepare, practice, and persevere.